And we're back. Yeah, so we're discovering Tony, and he was an aspiring model. He was going to a university, had friends, was looking for real love. Um, he also decides that he wants to be independent and move away from his loving mom, who had been so protective of him. Um, Also, by the way, shout out for, I want to say, I don't know if this is going across the board for like from Insecure to Ryan Murphy, for American Horror Story, and actors of yesteryear that we haven't necessarily seen in a very long time being, utilized, best utilized for these shows. Karen Molina White plays Tony's mom in this particular series, and I knew her face looked familiar, and I was like, where have I seen her? And I was like, A Different World. I was such a fan of A Different World, and she was on the season that Jada Pinkett Smith, well, Jada Pinkett at the time, was on that particular season. So again, just do a little quick Google search and you'll find them. But she, again, nonetheless, these are great actors from the 90s. And she was playing the mom here, and your heart breaks for her. But yeah, what I wanted to make a point is that when we're introduced to Tony and how unfortunately he crosses paths with Jeffrey, and they have like honestly like almost like a connection, a chemistry at the very beginning. And and when I rewatched the episode, I couldn't help but wonder, like, why particularly was it that with Tony, his instinct of like instantaneously putting that sleeping drug in their drink and luring them back to the apartment so that he can have his way with them, it didn't happen like in the first encounter that they have. In fact, he waits, he hesitates. Now, again, keep in mind that a lot that you're seeing for the show is open to creative license, but we're to understand that with Tony it was different. That there were instances that they got close. He really liked him, and he didn't want to do that. I think he thought that he was establishing a close relationship, something of an intimate nature that wasn't like with the others. The others were like just cut and dry. Let's have sex. Even the encounter he has after his first killing, that guy, maybe that there were instances. Well, the guy that introduces him to the bathhouses, I think he wanted to establish something with him, but that wasn't a victim. The guy that came after, soon after, which that's why they were, the interrogating officer had mentioned that there were two Stevens back to back, and he was like, oh, there were, because he was just so oblivious to what he was doing or who he was doing it to. But he himself had taken accidentally the drug that he wanted, the Mickey that they used to call back in the day, in the drink, and so he almost didn't even get to do what he wanted, that urging of wanting to do what he wanted. Up until this point, he hadn't been killing. He had just been like giving them the drug, having his way with them, and then just bouncing, but then leaving the person almost unconscious, if not comatose, and that's why he was banned from the bathhouses. So he just started doing it in the hotels, and with this guy in particular, even though he knew what he was putting his victims through, he was so persistent on doing what he needed to do to get his fix that he blacks out and still is able to do what he wanted, but then he killed him accidentally. He beat him to a pulp. I think there's a really brutal scene where you see like his rib cage had like been beaten in, that you can only imagine that perhaps the bones punctured the lung. It's gruesome. And with Tony, Tony like even introduces Jeff to his modeling world, and they have like really adorable, near, dare I say, near adorable instances where they look like they could be an actual coupling. And Dahmer even like cleans up his act. They said around this, like, again, when you start doing a bunch of research on YouTube, there are instances that his parents had said his dad and his stepmom have visited him and he had cleaned up his act. So perhaps maybe they've sandwiched certain circumstances together, or maybe it was an outcome of him meeting Tony that he wanted to clean up his act. But I think up until this point, they hadn't been intimate yet. And there's an instance where, yeah, they have like this little like spark when Jeffrey introduces Tony to some like game he made up when he was a child. And they have a connection, and then, yeah, they are intimate. But, you know, like most people who have to get up early in the morning and go work, he couldn't handle that. Anybody just walking out on him, he just assumed that they would never come back. And he kept having to like write on notepads because he figured that, you know, he wasn't too privy on how to do sign language. And even though Tony knew how to read really well lips, he made it easier for him. He said that he was worth the effort. But when you rewatch it, or at least I had to rewatch that episode, you question why was he able to survive so many dates? And it's almost like as if they dated for a small period of time. And I think it was because up until this point, all his other victims, you know, they were able bodies and they can speak and have opinions and want to interject. And he didn't want all that. That was just too excessive, maybe perhaps too much stimulus for him. Something was an issue there. I think when he was arrested and they finally diagnosed him, he had pedophilia, schizophrenia, a number of other things. And maybe it was just he wanted absolute control of that person. And though Tony had his own free will, he couldn't verbalize it. So it wasn't this constant bombardment. Again, I'm not excusing behavior. I'm just trying to best psychoanalyze through a novice perspective because I'm not licensed. But that's the interpretation that I am to understand of why there was maybe longevity possibilities. But really, would there have been? Because even if they had dated and he had never killed poor Tony, would their relationship have survived? Like, hey, by the way, on the low, I'm a serial killer. So, but still, nonetheless, it was so disheartening. And then when the family loses him and he goes missing and they know something's wrong, and he's such an ass because, like, he knows that they're doing fundraisers to find him, and he's even donating to their cause, knowing that you were the cause, but nobody being none the wiser. It was a hard episode to watch because, you know, then we see towards the end of the episode how unfortunately Tony met his demise. Like he had like left and he had told him to trust him, but he came back because he couldn't find his dang keys, and that was just too much for Dahmer, and he goes literally ham on him and clobbers him over the head with a hammer. And he was like and I think if I'm not mistaken, he was one of the victims that he tried to turn into a zombie. He would drill holes into his victims and then inject acid, you know, hoping that they would be kind of like in this comatose state but not dying, and perhaps convince them to be there like a sex slave. It never happened because, again, brain injury does not work that way, and they wouldn't survive, and they would eventually die, and he would have to do what he would do, which, you know, decompose, dismember. It was so hard to watch all of this. Also, we learned that when he is caught, and we also I think soon after him, I think is when so the other victim that was another 14-year-old boy was brother. I mean, unfortunately, this poor family, what they didn't endure. They already had one child that was sexually assaulted by Dahmer, who's 14, and then a couple of years later his brother would die at the hands of him. And the worst part here is that, like, the neighbor Glenda tried countless times to flag down police, to notify something was wrong, that this boy they called the police because he had stumbled out of Dahmer's apartment, naked, near naked, and incoherent, dazed, confused, bleeding. And they knew that he looked relatively young, that there was something wrong, that he did not appear to be an adult. And they kept insisting for the cops to verify. And once they knew that there were perhaps a gay couple, a gay coupling, they washed their hands of it. So for this episode, when I think it's called Cassandra, episode 7, they finally catch him, and they find all of these things, and they realize that he was just a heinous serial killer. Glenda seems to get some form of vindication, but she was like letting it be known, I let y'all know. And then there's audio too that had played, I forget which episode, perhaps this very episode that you hear, or the episode where he committed this horrible crime with this young boy, that she did try to follow up with the police. She kept asking and insisting, did you verify if he was an adult? And also, I think once the family let it be known that he had gone missing, she even tried to contact the FBI, to no avail. They washed their hands. Nobody made any efforts. And this is where it gets very, not interesting, but introspective, in the sense that, did Jeffrey target these particular victims, which majority were African American men, some were Latinos, and some were Asian, because they knew, and in this particular part of town, that they wouldn't be missed, that they would go missing, and the cops would behave the way that they did. Had Dahmer been a person of color himself, or the victims been white, would they have had the same, would they have not really made much of an effort to find these people? And would they have, like, perhaps persisted in finding out if that last boy, because had they caught him at that point, they literally had the evidence right there with the boy incoherent, injured, and that could have maybe stopped the process of all the people that followed, because there was a handful of them that came soon after. But the fact that that had fallen on their laps and they let it go, and Glenda even insisted. Again, there's so much information here from this particular case that we just didn't know. I mean, we knew in passing. I remember when this news broke, and I was still relatively young. I was like a preteen, so you didn't know much about this. You just heard that, he had been a cannibal, and had committed all these heinous crimes, but you didn't know the specifics of it. And also, remember, we didn't have access to a lot of media content. What we got in the news is what we got in the news. We didn't know of all this research and testimony and testimonials from other people, and accounts from the victims, the people who bared witness, the neighbors, how traumatizing it was for the neighbors, how once he was caught, it was almost as if this boogeyman essence of him lingered there. The fact that for a portion of the time they also had to vacate the apartment complex because they had found so much evidence and acids and all types of craziness that could pollute, perhaps, and even contaminate other neighbors. It was wild. It was outrageous what happened. So you didn't know all the specifics. And I understand that the families are very upset, because it's like reopening a wound that just won't allow to heal. But at the same time, I do feel that this particular docuseries was so informative. I think it served a purpose in shining a light of what had happened, and also to give much props to this woman who unfortunately no longer lives, Glenda Cleveland. And that she deserved much more. She deserves so much more than this little rinky-dinky plaque that they gave her. She was able to get media coverage at that time, almost to a default, because it's almost as if she had liberty to say what was happening, which traumatized her and her family. But some people were also opposed to her even speaking. The job that she worked for were a conservative company that, thought that her speaking ill of the cops, that it would be a backlash to them. And again, to what service? Like, it's almost as if she was not only being ignored, but now she was being muzzled, um, because she was speaking her truth. I didn't even know Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was always been known as a social activist and known for New York City, but I didn't even know he had gone down to Wisconsin and had personally met her. They had encounters where they spoke about what happened, and you can see her fragility and trying to have, she was trying to save these people. And so it's heartbreaking to see. And yeah, that she got this little rinky dinky plaque, and she was honored for a number of other women organizations, but was that enough? And then the two cops that washed their hands clean, they were suspended but then reinstated just because of the simple fact that the union fought for them. Not for nothing, and it also gives you kind of a perspective, because remember, we want to act like all these MAGA enthusiasts, it was sparked in recent years because of Trump. To be perfectly honest, they've been lying underneath it all. I think these people today and age, and if they're still part of the force, I'm sure they're a good bunch of Trump supporters. That was the demographic. They washed their hands clean of a good portion of those victims. In fact, after that Asian family lost their son, and all the families came together and sued, rightfully sued, civil suit, to the state and to the police, they were still being harassed. The cops were calling them. Again, I don't want to target a particular grouping here, but facts are facts. And they were doing this to this poor, unfortunate family. They got a good portion of funds back, but does that ever replace or heal what happened? The best way that the best resolution that they came up with was to demolish the building where Jeff had committed those crimes. But Glenda, if anything, wanted a park there. They never listened to her, and to this day, it's still just sitting an empty lot there. Just them wanting to wash their hands clean of it. Also, because perhaps people just don't want to be associated with what happened on that property, so no one's ever invested. And then we also learned that Jeff was kind of a dick. Like, the fact that he had been in there for all the garbage he did, all the heinous crimes that he committed, and he was acting like a celebrity in there, selling his autograph and playing with food and pretending like it was dismembered body parts, trying to pass the time, kind of like the fool he was in high school. He was now a fool as an adult, and though he was getting better care, perhaps, and also, again, because he's off his rocker, they were keeping him isolated. Plus, also, there were a couple attempts against his life. He was stabbed once in the neck but survived. But because of that arrogance and, again, access to things, fans were sending him stuff, photos of themselves, nudes, money. It's amazing to me how then, like, again, I want to say it was a particular grouping, perhaps what would become future Trump supporters that were kind of applauding him. So another inmate couldn't take it, and I think his name was, hold on a second, Christopher Scarver, who was also an inmate and was there as well because of murder charges, but he was a turnaround Christian and took his Christianity and his repentance very seriously, while he felt, and there was actual evidence that Dahmer did not show that repentance. In fact, he wanted to maybe perhaps even repent because John Wayne Gacy had given himself to Christ, and he thought, well, if I give myself to Christ, I'm absolved from my sins. And he found that very offensive, Christopher. And there's an encounter in the gym because they had to work while they were in there, and he bludgeoned him. He bludgeoned him and another man that was in there who had killed his wife and pinned the crime onto black men. And yeah, they were all seeing life in prison. The interesting part, and again, this could be creative license, but you see that even though Dahmer wanted death, and he knew that what he had committed was horrible, and that he was sane when he did it. It wasn't that he was hearing voices or anything like that. He still seemed like he wanted to keep living, because he did try to, at least in the show, he tries to survive. But it's something to have seen the process of this and how it panned out, and how things were left for public consumption and public